Hello everyone, and welcome back to the archives. I know many of you are listening to this as the day finally lets go of its hold on you. Perhaps hoping to take your mind off the pain or simply to quiet the noise of the waking world. So, before we begin, let's take a deep breath together. Lower the volume until my voice is just a murmur in the room. Let the darkness of the screen match the darkness behind your eyes. We are safe here. Tonight, we drift through the archives of the past, visiting quiet neighborhoods and riverside banks where silence tells the loudest story. We are here not to be startled, but to understand the stillness that follows the storm. If you are joining us for a pain-enforced nap, or if you are simply a member of the Insomnia Club looking for a place to rest, know that you are in the right place. The rain continues to fall outside, washing the streets clean, and we have nowhere else to be. It was a time when the world moved at a slower, more deliberate rhythm. The year was 1976. It was an era before the constant digital hum that fills our modern lives, a time when a ringing phone was the only tether to the outside world, a mechanical trill that demanded attention in an otherwise silent room. In the suburbs of Pennsylvania, the transition from winter to spring was underway. The air was crisp, holding the memory of frost in the morning, but yielding to a pale, warming sun by the afternoon. In these neighborhoods, silence had a texture. It was composed of the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway, the settling of wooden floorboards as the house cooled in the evening, and the distant, rhythmic sound of a dog barking 2 streets over. It was a silence that felt heavy, not with dread, but with a weight of routine. People live their lives in these quiet pockets, unaware that the distance between a sanctuary and a crime scene is sometimes measured only by the width of a street. Tonight, we travel back to that specific frequency of silence, to a Friday in March where the ordinary was about to be broken, not by a shout, but by a quiet, patient wait in the shadows. We often believe that our homes are vessels, containers that hold not just our possessions, but the very energy of the lives lived within them. A house occupied by 7 people does not simply sit on a foundation. It vibrates with a current of activity, a constant low-level hum of voices, footsteps, and the opening and closing of doors. It is a battery that charges during the day and expends its warmth into the night. But when that energy is suddenly removed, the silence that rushes in to fill the void is not peaceful. It is heavy. It is physical. On a quiet residential street in Traverse, Pennsylvania, the Apt family home usually possessed this vibrant current. It was a 2-story house in Bensalem Township, a structure that had absorbed the laughter and arguments of a large family for years. But on the afternoon of March 12, 1976, the house stood against the gray sky with a stillness that was absolute. The weather that day was indecisive, the kind of March afternoon that cannot decide between the lingering chill of winter and the promise of spring. The trees were bare, their branches tracing skeletal patterns against the clouds, and the ground was damp, smelling of wet earth and old leaves. Michael Apt, 21 years old, arrived at the family home expecting the familiar chaotic warmth that usually greeted him. For a family of 7, the house was rarely still. There was usually the sound of a television playing in the den, the clatter of dishes from the kitchen, or the heavy thud of the St. Bernard walking across the floor. But as Michael stepped onto the porch, The silence of the neighborhood seemed to pool around the front door. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air in the hallway was still, undisturbed by the movement of people. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that pierced the windows, settling slowly on the furniture in a way that suggested hours of inactivity. Michael knew, instantly, that the rhythm of the house had been broken. The specific energy he was used to, the chaotic, messy, beautiful noise of family, was gone. He moved through the ground floor, his footsteps sounding unnaturally loud on the carpet. He called out, but his voice was absorbed by the walls, returning no echo, no answer. It was a silence that felt heavy, pressing against his ears. He expected to hear the Saint Bernard, a dog known for its friendly but noisy nature, bounding towards him. But there was no sound of paws on the floor. There was no panting breath. There was only the ticking of the clock, marking time in a house that seemed to have stopped. As he moved deeper into the home, the visual details began to align with the auditory void. He saw shadows on the floor that shouldn't have been there. Dark stains that marred the familiar patterns of the rug. Bloody rags were scattered like discarded clothing, disrupting the order of the hallway. It was a scene that didn't register immediately as violence, but as a profound disorder, a violation of the domestic rules that govern the home. Michael did not stay to investigate the source of the silence. The instinct that governs us all, the one that warns us when a sanctuary has become a trap, took hold. He turned and ran from the house, his breath forming clouds in the cold air as he reached the safety of the street. The police arrived shortly after, their sirens cutting through the quiet neighborhood, a jarring intrusion into the stillness. The investigation that followed was procedural, a slow and methodical uncovering of the tragedy that had unfolded in the hours prior. Officers entered the home with the caution of men who knew that silence often hid the worst secrets. They moved through the rooms, noting the same heavy stillness that Michael had felt. They found the source of the shadows in the basement. It was a discovery that would change the history of Bensalem Township forever. Lying on the concrete floor were the bodies of 6 people. 5 were members of the Apt family: the mother, the father, 2 sisters, and a brother. The 6th was the fiancé of one of the daughters. Beside them lay the family dog, the Saint Bernard, silenced just like the rest. There was no chaos in the basement, only a terrible finality. They had each been shot once in the side of the head. It appeared to be an execution, methodical and cold. The investigation would later determine that this was not a sudden explosion of violence, but a slow, calculated dismantling of a family. The house had been emptied of its life, one person at a time, over the course of a single afternoon. The police noted the lack of struggle. There were no overturned chairs, no shattered lamps. The house upstairs remained largely undisturbed, save for the dark stains Michael had seen. It was as if the house itself had been forced to hold its breath, waiting for a release that never came. The silence Michael had walked into was not empty. It was full of the aftermath. But this silence was not an accident. It was a construction, hours in the making. It was the result of a patience that is difficult to comprehend. As the police secured the scene and the neighbors gathered behind their curtains, watching the flashing lights reflect off the wet pavement. The question wasn't just who had done this. The question was how someone could sit in the quiet of that home, listening to the clock tick and wait for the silence to be broken, only to restore it again and again. To understand the depth of the silence in the apt home, we must shift our perspective. We must move from the horror of the discovery to the mundane, terrifying patience of the waiting. The timeline of the afternoon was not swift. It did not happen in a blur of motion. It happened in the slow, agonizing creep of the minute hand on the wall clock. The intruder was a man named George Geschwind. He was 24 years old, a neighbor who lived just 90 feet away. On that Friday morning, he did not storm the house. He entered quietly through the back kitchen door, wearing rubber gloves to mask his presence. He carried with him a pistol, a tool of finality. But his primary weapon that day was time. George did not rampage through the rooms. He did not search for valuables or tear through drawers. Instead, he found a spot in the center of the family's life. He sat on a piano stool. Imagine the sensory experience of that weight. The wood of the stool was hard beneath him. The house was empty when he arrived, save for the dog, which he silenced first to ensure his own quiet. And then, he simply sat. He watched the light shift across the floorboards as the afternoon sun moved from the high point of noon towards the western horizon. He listened to the refrigerator hum in the kitchen. He listened to the settling of the house. He waited. He waited for 6 hours. It is a span of time that feels endless when you are doing nothing. 6 hours is enough time to read a book, to drive across the state, to watch the weather change from bright to overcast. George spent it sitting in the dim light of a neighbor's home, letting the afternoon dissolve into evening. He was a patient man, anchored by a dark resolve that kept him still, while the world outside continued its busy pace. The arrival of the family members occurred in a rhythm that George was ready for. The silence was broken in intervals. First, the children arrived home from school. The door opened, bringing with it the sounds of the playground and the street, only for those sounds to be extinguished moments later. He moved them to the basement, creating a pile of shadows in the dark. And then he returned to his post. He cleaned the floor. He wiped away the trails. He reset the stage. Then came the mother, home from her work at the Internal Revenue Service. Then the older daughter. Then the father, home from the telephone company. And finally, the fiancé. Each arrival was a punctuation mark in the long sentence of the afternoon. The door would open. The hum of life would briefly return to the hallway. And then George would rise from the piano stool to restore the silence. There was a clinical nature to his actions. He did not rush. When the timeline accelerated in the early evening, when the father and the fiancé arrived in quick succession, he adapted. He could not carry everyone to the basement. The fatigue of the physical labor began to set in, so he dragged them to the stairs. He was managing a logistical problem, treating the family he once knew not as people, but as tasks to be completed. But there was one sound that George could not control, one sound that pierced his calm and frayed the edges of his patience: the telephone. In the midst of the quiet, the rotary phone on the wall began to ring. It was a mechanical, jarring sound. Burring. Burring. It echoed through the empty hallway, demanding an answer that no one could give. George sat on the stool, his gloved hands gripping his knees, listening to the phone scream for attention. He knew who was missing. He knew that Michael and his brother Clifford were not yet home. He had planned to wait for them. He had planned to complete the circle, to extinguish the entire family line. But the phone kept ringing. In his mind, the sound transformed into a threat. Was it a neighbor who had heard a noise? Was it the police calling to check? Was it a warning? The ringing phone became a psychological barrier he could not cross. It made him nervous in a way the act of murder had not. The silence he had carefully constructed was being assaulted by the outside world. Around 6:30 in the evening, as the shadows in the house deepened into true night, George made a decision. The phone had broken his nerve. He stood up from the piano stool, leaving the remaining silence for Michael to find. He walked out of the house, perhaps through the same back door he had entered, and stepped back into the cool March air. He left as quietly as he had arrived, walking the 90 feet back to his own home, back into the anonymity of the night. Behind him, the opt house stood dark and still, a vessel that had been emptied, holding its secrets until the morning light would reveal them. The phone eventually stopped ringing, and the house settled into the heavy, final silence that Michael would walk into just hours later. The investigation that followed the discovery in the basement was intense, but for days, the police were baffled. They looked for enemies. They looked for motives buried in the father's work or the mother's career. They searched for a stranger, a drifter, a phantom who had passed through town. But the answer, as is so often the case in these stories, was not in the distance. It was right across the street. 10 days after the silence fell over the Apt home, the truth began to surface. It started with the innocence of children. A group of kids fishing in a nearby creek found something that didn't belong in the water. It was a pistol. The metal was cold and wet, discarded by someone who thought the water would wash away the history attached to it. The police traced the weapon. It led them not to a hardened criminal from the city, but to George Geschwind, the 24-year-old landscaper who lived diagonally across the street from the Apt family. The revelation sent a shockwave through the community that was different from the initial horror. This was a betrayal of proximity. George was not a stranger. He was a childhood friend. In the years before the silence, George had played with Michael and Clifford. They had ridden bikes together on those same streets. They had played pool. They had been boys together, growing up under the same canopy of trees. But time had eroded that connection. Michael would later say they had drifted apart, that George had become a loner, a strange dude who stayed in his house and withdrew from the world. But George remembered it differently. In his mind, the distance was not just a drift. It was a rejection. He felt bullied. He felt humiliated. He harbored a resentment that grew in the quiet of his own room, feeding on perceived slights till it transformed into a personal vendetta. When George was brought in for questioning, he confessed. He described the events of that Friday with a detachment that chilled the investigators. He called the ambush his only achievement in life. He spoke of the waiting, of the piano stool, of the phone that wouldn't stop ringing. He admitted that he had wanted to stay for Michael and Clifford. He had wanted to finish it. The aftermath for the surviving brothers, Michael and Clifford, was a slow-motion tragedy of its own. The discovery of the betrayal broke something in them that could not be fixed. When they learned it was George, the boy they had once known, the anger was volcanic. There were reports of a fist fight between the brothers, a physical manifestation of the grief they couldn't articulate. Michael tried to storm the Geschwind house, driven by a primal need for retribution, only to be tackled by police in the yard. "I'm gonna kill him when I get him," Michael said, his mouth swollen from the fight. "I haven't talked to him in 8 years. It was senseless." And it was senseless. It was a tragedy born of a festering silence in one home that traveled across the street to destroy another. George Geschwind was tried and found guilty. The judicial process moved with its own slow, grinding rhythm. He was sentenced to die. A sentence later commuted to life in prison as laws changed and years passed. He would spend the rest of his days in a different kind of box, a different kind of silence. But for the neighborhood of Trevose, the lesson remained. The distance between friend and stranger is sometimes measured only by the width of a street. The walls we build to keep the world out also keep our secrets in. And sometimes, the person watching the lights go out in your home is not a guardian, but a ghost from your own past, waiting for the door to open. While Pennsylvania mourned the loss of a family and the breaking of a community's trust, another tragedy was unfolding across state lines. The darkness that touched the Apt home was not unique. It was a shadow that stretched across the map. And our next story takes us to Indiana, to the banks of a quiet creek where the water flows over stones that have settled there for centuries, indifferent to the history they witness. The creek flows indifferent to history, washing over stones that have settled there for centuries. It is a place where the water moves with a gentle, persistent rhythm, carving its path through the limestone and the earth. White Lick Creek, near Mooresville, Indiana, is one of those places that feels removed from the urgency of the highway. Sycamore trees line the banks, their white bark standing out like bones against the gray of a rainy afternoon. On Saturday, April 28th, 1979, the creek was swollen with spring rain. The air was heavy with moisture, and the sky was a bruised purple, threatening a storm that never quite broke. It was a day that should have been forgotten. A simple calendar page turned in the history of Morgan County. Terry Chastain was 23 years old. She was a mother, a role that defined her days with a rhythm of care and routine. She had 3 children, Misty, who was 5, Mark, who was 4, and little Stephen, who was just 3. They were a tight-knit unit, a constellation of 4 moving through the world together. That morning began with the mundane choreography of family life. There was the dressing of children, the finding of shoes, the packing of bags. Terry was on her way to work at a supermarket, a job that kept the lights on and the pantry full. She was driving the children to the babysitter, a routine drive down Interstate 465 that she had likely done 100 times before. But routine is a fragile thing. It relies on the assumption that the world will behave today as it did yesterday. Sometime before 6 in the morning, a red and gray truck pulled alongside Terry's car. The driver, a man with blonde hair, signaled to her. He pointed to her tire, mouthing the words that every driver dreads: flat tire, pull over. Terry, trusting the signal, pulled her car to the shoulder. It was a decision made in a split second, a reaction to a perceived mechanical failure. The man pulled over behind her. He got out of his truck, appearing helpful. A good Samaritan on a lonely stretch of highway in the early morning light. He opened the hood of her car. He fiddled with the wires. And then he delivered the news. The car wouldn't start. He offered a ride. It seemed like a kindness, a way to get the children out of the cold, to get Terry to work. And so, the constellation of four moved from their car into the red and gray truck. They left their vehicle on the side of the road, a steel shell abandoned in the grass, and stepped into the vehicle of a stranger. The truck did not go to the babysitter. It did not go to the supermarket. It turned off the main road, winding its way toward the seclusion of White Lick Creek. The journey changed from a rescue to an abduction in silence. We can only imagine the confusion that must have set in as the landscape shifted from the highway to the trees, from the safety of the public road to the isolation of the riverbank. The man was Stephen Judy. He was 22 years old, a man with a history that was known to the police, but unknown to Terry. He was a man who carried a darkness that he had nurtured since childhood. When they arrived at the creek, the silence of the location was absolute. The water rushed over the rocks, masking the sounds of the struggle that followed. We will not dwell on the violence of that morning. We will not describe the details that the court documents later revealed in clinical, unfeeling text. It is enough to know that the light faded from the afternoon for Terry and her children. The water claimed them. The creek, which had flowed for centuries, became the final resting place for a mother and her 3 little ones. The silence of the woods returned, heavy and complicit, broken only by the sound of the red and gray truck driving away, leaving the tire tracks in the soft mud as the only witness to what had occurred. But witnesses are not always silent. As the truck pulled away, leaving the tragedy behind in the reeds, the world was already beginning to take notice. A witness had seen the truck. A witness had seen the blonde man. And though the creek tried to wash away the evidence, the truth has a way of rising to the surface, just like the stones in the water. I know many of you are listening to this as the day finally lets go of its hold on you. So let's take a deep breath together. Let the darkness of the screen match the darkness behind your eyes. We are safe here. Tonight, we drift through the archives of the past, visiting quiet neighborhoods and riverside banks where silence tells the loudest story. We are here not to be startled, but to understand the stillness that follows the storm. Wherever you are tonight, whether the moon is high above your roof or the first light of dawn is creeping through your curtains, I invite you to leave the waking world behind. I often wonder what time it is for you as you listen to this. In these quiet hours, the distance between us disappears, and we are simply travelers moving through the same dark, rain-soaked landscape. Our journey begins on a suburban street in Bensalem Township, Pennsylvania. The date is March 12th, 1976. The air is crisp, holding that specific damp chill that marks the transition from a hard winter to a hopeful spring. It is a time and place where front doors were often left unlocked, and the rhythm of the neighborhood was dictated not by digital notifications, but by the rising and setting of the sun. To understand what happened in the house we are about to visit, we must first understand the texture of the era. It was a time before the constant, low-level hum of the internet connected every room to the entire world. In 1976, the house could be truly silent. There were no glowing screens to light up the corners of a darkened bedroom. No vibrations on a nightstand to signal an incoming message. Instead, the silence of a mid-70s afternoon had a weight to it. It was thick and physical. The only sounds might be the settling of the wooden beams, the hum of a refrigerator in the kitchen, or the dust motes dancing in the shafts of afternoon sunlight that pierced through the heavy curtains. It was a time when a ringing phone was the only tether to the outside world, a mechanical trill that demanded attention in an otherwise silent room. When that phone rang, it meant something. It required a physical act to answer, walking to the wall, lifting the heavy receiver, tethered by a coiled cord. And when it didn't ring, the isolation was absolute. In the home of the Apt family, on that Friday in March, the phone would ring repeatedly. But before we answer it, we must sit with the silence that preceded it. It is in this quiet domestic space, among the wood-paneled walls and the shag carpets, that our story takes root. It is a reminder that sometimes the most profound tragedies do not begin with a shout, but with a long, patient wait in the shadows of a familiar room. The investigation into the tragedy at the Apt home began in a state of confusion. For the first few days, authorities admitted they did not know who had done this, and more importantly, they did not know why. There was no sign of a robbery gone wrong. There was no chaotic struggle. It appeared to be a cold, calculated ambush, carried out by a ghost who had slipped into the house and then vanished back into the suburban landscape. But ghosts, as we know, often leave footprints in the physical world. 10 days after the silence fell over the house in Trevose, a group of children were playing by a nearby creek, fishing in the shallow waters as the spring sun warmed the earth. It was an innocent scene, a stark contrast to the darkness that had gripped the neighborhood. There, amidst the stones and the flowing water, they found a pistol. It was the loose thread that would unravel the entire mystery. The weapon was traced not to a stranger drifting through town, but to a young man who lived just 90 feet away. George Geschwind was a neighbor. He lived diagonally across the street. He was a face the Apt family saw every day, a fixture of the neighborhood who mowed his lawn and watched the world from his window. According to police reports, George had once been close with the surviving brothers, Michael and Clifford. In the golden haze of their childhood, the three boys had ridden bikes together and played pool, sharing the specific, unstructured freedom of growing up in the 70s. But time had eroded that bond. Michael would later describe George as a loner, a very strange dude who withdrew from the world. Rumors suggested a darker undercurrent, that Michael and Clifford had bullied George, excluding him and mocking his family. Whether it was isolation or resentment, something festered in the quiet hours of George's life. He told police it was a personal vendetta. He felt humiliated. And in his mind, the only way to restore his dignity was to destroy the source of his pain. He had purchased the gun, practiced with it, and waited for his moment. He admitted that he had wanted to kill Michael and Clifford most of all. But the telephone, that persistent, mechanical ringing, had made him nervous. He feared a neighbor had heard the shots. So he left, leaving the two brothers alive to carry the weight of the aftermath. The revelation that the killer was the boy next door shattered what little stability remained for the surviving brothers. The trauma manifested in a senseless act of violence between them. Michael and Clifford were seen getting into a fist fight with each other in front of a newspaper reporter, their grief turning inward and then outward. Michael even tried to storm the Geschwind house, screaming that he would kill his former friend before being tackled by police in the yard. Justice, when it came, was bureaucratic and final. A jury found George Geschwind guilty, although initially sentenced to die. Changes in state law meant his sentence was commuted to life in prison. He remains there to this day, an old man in a medium security facility, far removed from the street where he once played. The surviving brothers, however, found no such peace. Their lives spiraled into a haze of drugs and jail time. The wreckage of that March afternoon extending decades into the future. We often think of danger as something that comes from the outside, a stranger passing through town. But sometimes, the distance between safety and tragedy is measured only by the width of a street. While the neighborhood in Pennsylvania tried to heal, the seasons continued to turn. 3 years later, and several hundred miles to the west, another tragedy was taking shape along the banks of a different body of water. The rain that falls in Pennsylvania eventually finds its way to the rivers. And tonight, our journey follows the current to the quiet, Midwestern state of Indiana. On a Saturday in April, near a place called White Lick Creek, the silence of the morning was about to be broken. The creek flows indifferent to history, washing over stones that have settled there for centuries. It winds through the landscape of Morgan County, Indiana, cutting a path through the limestone and the soil, a silent witness to the passage of time. On the morning of April 28, 1979, the water of White Lick Creek was moving slowly, carrying the chill of a spring that had not yet fully surrendered to the warmth of the sun. The sycamore trees that lined the banks stood like sentinels, their pale bark reflecting the gray light of a sky that promised rain but held it back, suspending the world in a state of quiet anticipation. It was a Saturday, in the nearby town of Mooresville. The day began with the ordinary rituals of a weekend morning. Coffee pots were brewing in kitchens where the linoleum was worn from years of footsteps. Radios played low in the background, offering weather reports and local news to families just waking up. For 23-year-old Terry Chasteen, the morning was not about leisure, but routine. She was a young mother, navigating the demands of single parenthood with a resilience that often goes unnoticed in the grand sweep of history. Terry was on her way to work at a local supermarket. But first, there was the drop-off. Her 3 children, Misty, who was 5, Mark, 4, and little Stephen, just 3 years old, were bundled into the car. We can imagine the scene, one that plays out in driveways across the world every day. The scramble for shoes, the double-checking of lunch bags, the gentle chaos of 3 small children settling into the back seat, their voices filling the car with a specific, high-pitched energy of youth. They were heading to the babysitter's house, a mundane journey on a stretch of Interstate 465 that should have been forgotten the moment it was completed. The car moved steadily along the asphalt. The landscape of Indiana rolled by, a tapestry of flat fields and developing suburbs. Terry was a careful driver, focused on the road, unaware that the timeline of her life was running parallel to a red and gray truck decked out for construction work. Inside that truck was a man named Stephen Judy. He was 22 years old, with blonde hair and a history that was invisible to the casual observer. To Terry, he was just another traveler on the road, a stranger in the lane beside her. Sometime before 6 o'clock in the morning, the rhythm of the drive was interrupted. The man in the truck pulled alongside Terry's car. He gestured urgently, pointing to her tire, signaling that something was wrong. It is a moment of vulnerability that relies on the social contract of the road, the belief that when a stranger waves for your attention, they are offering help, not harm. Terry, trusting the signal, pulled her car to the shoulder. The gravel crunched beneath the tires as the vehicle came to a halt. The engine idled, a low hum that masked the silence of the surrounding fields. The man pulled over as well. He offered to help. He opened the hood of her car, leaning into the machinery. But this was not an act of repair. It was a dismantling. He removed the coil wire, silencing the engine, ensuring that the car would not start again. When the key turned in the ignition and met only silence, he offered a ride. It was a change of course, a deviation from the map. Terry and her 3 children transferred from their car into the red and gray truck. They left behind the safety of their vehicle, stepping out of the known world and into the cab of a stranger's truck. The drive that followed took them away from the babysitter's house, away from the supermarket, and toward the secluded banks of White Lick Creek. The area near State Road 67 was quiet. The water moved over the rocks with a soothing, repetitive sound. It was a place where people might go to fish or to think, or to simply be alone with the trees. But on this morning, the solitude was heavy. The truck pulled off the road. The doors opened. The family stepped out onto the damp earth, surrounded by the smell of wet leaves and the sound of the creek. We will not linger on the violence that followed. The details are a matter of public record. But here, in the quiet of this space, we focus on the stillness that reclaimed the scene. The water claimed them. The light faded from the afternoon, and the creek continued its journey downstream, carrying with it the secrets of what had transpired. The children, who had started their day with the simple expectation of play, were silenced by the water. Terry, who had fought for her family, was found where the earth meets the stream. Later, witnesses would recall seeing the truck. They would remember the blonde man. They would piece together the timeline of a red and gray vehicle that stood out against the green and brown of the landscape. But in the immediate aftermath, there was only the sound of the wind in the sycamores and the endless, indifferent flow of White Lick Creek, moving over stones that would hold their silence for eternity, while the silence of the creek in Indiana would eventually be broken by the discovery. The silence inside the Apt family home in Pennsylvania was carefully maintained, hour by hour. We travel back 3 years earlier, to that crisp March afternoon in 1976, to understand how a house full of life was systematically quieted. The intruder was not a stranger who burst in with chaos and noise. He was a familiar face, a neighbor who lived just 90 feet away, and his weapon of choice was not just a pistol, but patience. George Geschwind did not rush. He entered through the back kitchen door, wearing rubber gloves to mask his presence, and simply sat down. He chose a piano stool in the living room as his vantage point. For 6 hours, he sat there, It is difficult to imagine the texture of that weight. The house was empty when he arrived. The only sounds were the mundane hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall, marking time in a room that was about to lose it. He watched the afternoon light shift across the floorboards, the pale sun of early spring stretching the shadows of the furniture until they touched the far wall. He was a patient man, sitting in the dim light of a neighbor's home, letting the afternoon dissolve into evening. The violence that followed was not a frenzy, but a series of finalities. At 3 p.m., the silence was broken by the sound of the front door. Kathy and John Jr. arrived home from school, their voices filling the entryway with the chaotic energy of youth. But that energy was brief. The intruder met them, and the house returned to its stillness. He did not leave them where they fell. He carried them to the basement, placing them side by side, restoring order to the living space above. 2 hours passed. The light outside began to fade into a bruised purple twilight. At 5:15 p.m., Margaret arrived, then Margie, then John Sr., then Gary. Each arrival was a repetition on the last, the sound of a key in the latch, the opening of the door, a moment of recognition, and then the restoration of silence. He moved with a clinical detachment, dragging the later victims to the top of the stairs when there was no longer time to carry them down. He took a cloth and wiped the floor, removing the trails of what had happened, ensuring that the house remained a vessel of quiet. But there was one sound he could not control. As the evening deepened, the telephone began to ring. It was a mechanical trill, loud and demanding in the darkened house. George sat on the piano stool, his gloved hands resting on his knees, and listened to it ring. Once, twice, 10 times. It made him nervous. In the silence he had constructed, the phone was a lifeline to the outside world, a signal that people were noticing the absence of the family. He knew that 2 brothers, Michael and Clifford, were still out there. He had planned to wait for them. He had planned to complete the circle. But the phone kept ringing, echoing through the empty halls like an alarm. He worried that a neighbor might have heard something. He worried that the ringing would never stop. And so, around 6:30 p.m., governed by the anxiety of a ringing telephone, he made a calculated choice. He stood up from the stool where he had spent the afternoon. He checked the floor one last time for marks. He left as quietly as he'd arrived, walking out the back door and slipping into the anonymity of the night, leaving the phone ringing in the dark behind him. The investigation into the silence of the Apt home began in a vacuum of answers. For 3 days, the authorities admitted they were tracking leads that went nowhere, baffled by a crime scene that offered no clear reason for such a sudden and absolute end to a family story. There was no robbery, no signs of a struggle that suggested a chaotic break-in. It was, as the detectives noted, a cold and calculated ambush, but the truth often hides in the places we least expect. And in this case, the key to the mystery was not found by a forensic team sweeping for fingerprints, but by children playing near a creek. 10 days after the house fell silent, children fishing in the local waters pulled something heavy from the mud. It was the weapon, discarded and forgotten, surrendered to the current. This discovery turned the gaze of the investigation inward, away from the concept of a wandering stranger and directly toward the house sitting diagonally across the street. The distance between friend and stranger is sometimes measured only by the width of a road. and in this case, that distance was exactly 90 feet. The man who had sat on the piano stool was George Geschwind, a 24-year-old neighbor and childhood friend of the surviving brothers, Michael and Clifford. The motive was not greed or theft, but a deep, festering sense of humiliation. He called it a personal vendetta. According to the records, George felt excluded, a sentiment that had curdled over the years into a poison. He had watched the Apt family from his window, observing a life he felt he had been pushed out of, until the resentment became the only thing he could feel. When the truth came to light, it did not bring peace to the survivors. It brought a different kind of chaos. The revelation that the danger had been living just a few yards away shattered what little stability Michael and Clifford had left. In a moment captured by newspaper reporters, the brothers' grief manifested as rage, not just at the killer, but at the world and each other, breaking out into a fist fight in the street. It was a physical expression of a pain that had no words. Michael even tried to storm the Geschwind house, desperate to confront the ghost of his childhood friend, but was stopped at the edge of the yard. Justice, however, is a slow and steady machine. George was arrested, tried, and eventually sentenced to life in prison. He would spend the rest of his days in a medium-security facility, far removed from the quiet street in Bensalem. The legal process did its work, closing the file and removing the threat from the community. But for the brothers who survived, the silence of the house was replaced by the noise of ruined lives, a tragic drift into instability that often follows such profound loss. It is a sobering reminder that sometimes the secrets kept behind drawn curtains are the heaviest burdens of all. We often look to the horizon for danger, forgetting that the most profound stories are often written by the boy next door, the quiet figure who waves from the driveway and then retreats into the shadows. While Pennsylvania mourned and the seasons began to turn, another tragedy was unfolding across state lines in Indiana. Along the banks of a quiet creek where the water flows over limestone and time seems to stand still. The creek flows indifferent to history, washing over stones that have settled there for centuries. It winds through the landscape of Morgan County, Indiana, cutting a path through the limestone and the clay, untouched by the passage of time or the secrets kept along its banks. On the morning of April 28, 1979, the water of White Lick Creek was moving slowly, reflecting a gray sky that hung low over the fields, heavy with the moisture of a Midwestern spring. The sycamore trees that lined the water stood like silent sentinels, their white bark peeling away to reveal the pale wood beneath, watching over a stillness that felt both ancient and absolute. It was a Saturday, and the air held that specific chill that lingers before the full warmth of May arrives. For 23-year-old Terry Chasteen, the day began with the familiar, comforting rhythm of a mother's routine. There were shoes to be tied and coats to be zipped. There was the scramble of breakfast and the soft chaos of 3 young children. Misty, who was 5, Mark, who was 4, and little Stephen, just 3 years old. They were a bundle of energy in the morning light, unaware that the world outside their car windows was anything other than a playground waiting to be explored. Terry was driving them to the babysitter before heading to her job at a local supermarket. It was the kind of mundane, responsible journey that millions of people take every day, a thread in the fabric of ordinary life. The car hummed along Interstate 465, the tires singing against the pavement, carrying them toward what they assumed was just another day. But fate often travels in the lane beside us, unnoticed until it signals a change of course. Sometime before 6 in the morning, a truck pulled alongside Terry's car. It was a red and gray pickup, decked out for construction work, driven by a man with blonde hair. He signaled to her, indicating a problem with her tire, a gesture of assistance that belongs to the code of the road. Trusting the kindness of a stranger, Terry pulled over onto the shoulder. The man, a 22-year-old named Stephen Judy, pulled in behind her. He offered help. He opened the hood. He disabled the vehicle with the practiced ease of someone who had decided that the morning would not end as it began. We often wonder about the moments where the path diverges. When the car wouldn't start, Judy offered Terry and her children a ride. It seemed like a solution. It seemed like safety. But the truck did not take them to the babysitter, nor to a service station. It turned away from the highway, driving down the quiet, unpaved roads that led toward the isolation of White Lick Creek. The events that followed are best left to the silence of the water. We know that the truck stopped near the creek bed, where the sound of the highway was replaced by the rustling of the wind in the dead leaves. We know that the children were sent down the path ahead, their small feet navigating the uneven ground. And we know that the light eventually faded from the afternoon, leaving the creek to reclaim its solitude. The water claimed them, one by one, washing away the noise of the day until only the sound of the current remained. When the discovery was made, it was not the violence that struck the community of Mooresville, but the profound unfairness of the silence that followed. The bodies of Terry and her 3 children were found along the creek, resting in the shallow water as if they had simply laid down to sleep. The violence of their final moments was swallowed by the landscape, leaving only the tragic evidence of a family interrupted. Witnesses would later recall seeing the red and gray truck near the creek that morning. One person remembered seeing a blond man getting into the vehicle, a figure who moved with the casual arrogance of someone who believed the world belonged to him. But by then, the truck was gone, driving back onto the roads of Indianapolis, merging back into traffic as if nothing had changed. The creek, however, remembered. It held the story in its currents, carrying the memory of Misty, Mark, and Stephen downstream, past the stones and the sycamores, waiting for the world to notice what had been lost. The silence of the creek would eventually be broken, not by the wind, but by the gavel of the court. The courtroom in Morgan County became a theater for a man who had long sought the spotlight, even if that light was cast by the flashbulbs of crime scene photographers. Stephen Judy did not shrink from the accusations leveled against him. Instead, he seemed to swell with them, absorbing the attention of the state like a man who had been starving for recognition his entire life. The investigation had pulled back the curtain on a history of systemic oversight, revealing a path paved with missed warnings. Years earlier, he had been diagnosed as a sexual psychopath, a clinical label that was buried in paperwork when he was placed into the foster home of Robert and Mary Carr. They had welcomed him in, unaware of the violence that had already taken root in his mind, unaware that the system designed to protect them had simply passed the danger along to their doorstep. But in the courtroom, Judy was not looking for understanding, nor was he looking for mercy. he was looking for a legacy. In a display of narcissism that baffled the public, he demanded the ultimate punishment. He told the judge, with a chilling clarity, that he honestly wanted the death penalty. He reasoned that if he were ever released, the darkness would take hold of him again. He threatened the jurors, speaking to them not as a defendant pleading for his life, but as a predator ensuring his own end. He listed their names. He mentioned their families. He orchestrated his own sentencing with the precision of a conductor, ensuring that the verdict of death was the only logical conclusion the jury could reach. To the media, he was a sensation, a modern-day outlaw who fancied himself the second coming of John Dillinger. He preened for the cameras, his blue eyes scanning the crowd to ensure all eyes were fixed on him. He reveled in the notoriety, comparing his own heinous acts to the legends of the past, unaware that history rarely remembers the monster with the same reverence it holds for the myth. He wanted to be the star of the show, and for a brief, turbulent period in Indiana history, he was. But stardom built on the suffering of innocence is a fragile thing. And the clock was ticking toward a final, quiet midnight. The end arrived on March 9th, 1981. There were no last-minute appeals, no decades spent languishing on death row. Judy had requested the express lane to oblivion, and the state had obliged. The execution was a procedural affair, stripped of the glamour he had sought in life. He was given 10 milligrams of Valium to steady his nerves, a chemical calm before the storm. As he was strapped into the electric chair, the witness curtain was drawn back, revealing the final stage he would ever occupy. A black cloth was placed over his face, obscuring the eyes that had looked upon Terry Chastain and her children with such indifference. There were no last words, no final speeches to the cameras he loved so much. The room was silent, save for the hum of the machinery. At 12:12 a.m., the current flowed, and the man who wanted the end finally received it. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the cap, a physical signal that the debt had been paid. He sought the darkness as a stage, and in the end, the darkness simply swallowed him whole. Stephen Judy was gone, his name destined to fade into the archives of criminal psychology. But the memory of Terry, Misty, Mark, and Stephen remained, not as victims of his vanity, but as the quiet, enduring heart of the tragedy. From the public spectacle of Indiana, where a killer demanded the world's attention, we moved now to the private, quiet calculations of a man in Rochester, New York. While Judy screamed for the spotlight, our next subject preferred the shadows, hiding his true nature behind the perfectly manicured facade of a helpful neighbor. In the quiet suburbs of Rochester, New York, the winters are long and the snow piles high against the foundations of the homes. It is a place where the cold demands cooperation, where neighbors rely on one another to keep the driveways clear and the sidewalks safe. In the mid-1960s and early 70s, James Turner was the man who answered that call. To those who lived on his street, he was the definition of a good neighbor, the kind of man who would wake up early in the freezing pre-dawn darkness to run his snowblower not just on his own property, but on the walkways of the elderly and the overwhelmed. He was a hard worker, a strict father, and a man who seemed to have built a perfect, quiet life in a new subdivision. He had constructed a monument to this appearance of stability, a $40,000 colonial house that stood proudly on the street It was a home that smelled of fresh lumber and new paint, filled with untouched furniture and the promise of the American dream. But the foundation of this house was not built on overtime hours or factory wages. It was built on a series of tragic misfortunes that seemed to follow James Turner like a shadow. A dark cloud that rained misfortune on everyone around him while leaving him perfectly and profitably dry. The pattern began in the summer of June 1964. It started with a silence. John Lewis Brown, a co-worker from the Nabisco plant, simply vanished. There was no goodbye, no note, and no body ever found. He disappeared into the ether, leaving behind only a $5,000 life insurance policy with a single beneficiary. James Turner. Because there was no body, the payout was delayed. But the ink on the ledger had already been dried. 4 years later, the silence returned, this time accompanied by a finality that could not be questioned. Frank Sildone, just 18 years old, was found with a bullet wound to the head. He had been preparing to buy a car, a transaction that required a life insurance policy to secure the loan. The co-signer was his helpful co-worker, James Turner. The car was never bought, but the debt of life was paid. The river claimed the next one. In May of 1969, the Genesee River, swollen with spring rains, carried the body of William Bradwell. He was another co-worker, another friend, and another man who had recently signed a document naming Turner as the beneficiary of a $5,000 policy. The water washed away the evidence, but the check cleared. The list continued to grow with a rhythmic, terrifying precision. Louis McDowell was found in his garage, the air thick with carbon monoxide, ruled a suicide. He too had recently changed his policy to favor his friend Jim. Then came Horace Everett, a man who held secret meetings with Turner, telling his wife they would soon be rich. Instead, he was found behind an abandoned factory, his life ended by a shotgun blast. To his neighbors, watching him clear the snow on those gray winter mornings, James Turner was a pillar of the community, a man of service and stability. But to the insurance adjusters reviewing the files in quiet offices, he was becoming a statistical anomaly. It is rare for lightning to strike the same place twice. It is impossible for it to strike 5 times, always leaving the same man holding the golden ticket. The paper trail was growing, a stack of documents that whispered a truth no one wanted to hear. Greed is a patient hunter, willing to wait years between strikes, hiding behind the mask of friendship. But paper trails, no matter how carefully constructed, eventually lead to the truth. While Turner hid his nature behind a friendly smile and a well-manicured lawn, the weight of the coincidences began to press down on the carefully built facade of his colonial home. Inside the walls of that carefully decorated colonial home, the atmosphere was shifting. During the legal battles with the insurance company over previous claims, a new member of the household had settled in. Dwight Dees, Turner's 20-year-old brother-in-law, had moved into the spare room while attending community college. He was a young man with a future ahead of him, unaware that his presence in the house had started a clock ticking in the mind of his host. In the fall of 1974, a curious administrative change occurred. Dwight, who had previously dropped a $50,000 life insurance policy due to the high cost of tuition, suddenly resumed the payments. It was a financial decision that seemed prudent on paper, ensuring security for his family. But in the context of the Turner household, It was a signature on a death warrant. The winter months rolled in, covering Rochester in a thick blanket of snow, and the house stood silent against the biting wind. On the night of January 21st, 1975, the silence of the countryside was broken, not by a scream, but by the mechanical crunch of metal. A borrowed car that Dwight had been driving was discovered nose down at the bottom of a 20-foot embankment. To a passing motorist, it appeared to be a tragic, yet common, winter accident. A vehicle losing traction on the icy roads and sliding into the darkness. But the snow, much like a blank page, records everything. When investigators arrived, their flashlights cutting through the crisp night air, the scene told a story that physics could not explain. Dwight was found inside the vehicle, but his injuries were far too severe to have been caused by the impact of the crash. The wounds to his neck suggested the use of a heavy blade, a violence that was personal and direct, rather than the random chaos of a traffic accident. The investigation quickly turned away from the car and toward the surrounding landscape. In the fresh snow, a trail of red led away from the vehicle, winding back several hundred feet to an old barn that stood like a sentinel in the field. It was behind this barn that the true event had taken place. The car at the bottom of the embankment was merely stagecraft, a final act designed to mask a cold-blooded calculation. A few days later, the discovery of a machete would confirm what the snow had already revealed. The friendly neighbor mask began to crack the following day. As the news of the accident broadcast across local television stations, an insurance agent sat in his living room watching the report. He recognized the name. He knew the policy. And he realized that James Turner had 50,000 reasons to want his brother-in-law dead. The phone call he made to the police connected the final dot in a constellation of suspicious deaths that had spanned over a decade. On January 22nd, James Turner was arrested. The man who had diligently snow-blown his neighbors' driveways and built a reputation as a pillar of the community was led away in handcuffs. The courts would eventually sentence him to 25 years at Attica Prison, bringing an end to a 12-year cycle of beneficiaries and burials. Greed is a patient hunter, but it often leaves tracks in the snow. While Turner hid his nature behind a friendly smile and a well-manicured lawn, another man was hiding his true self in the solitude of the riverbanks, far from the suburbs of Rochester, in the quiet, overgrown edges of America's waterways. A drifter was moving through the tall grass, carrying a secret that he had kept since 1963. The water has a way of keeping secrets, holding them beneath the surface where the light cannot reach. Along the canals of Florida and the winding riverbanks of Ohio, the reeds grow tall, and the air is thick with the scent of damp earth and slow-moving currents. These are places of solitude, where the only sounds are the wind rustling through the sawgrass and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the tension of the water. It was in these quiet, forgotten edges of the map that Stanley Everett Rice found his comfort. He was known to the few who remembered him as the stuttering drifter. Born in Massachusetts, Rice was a man who existed in the periphery of the waking world. He was described as polite, shy, and perpetually nervous. A figure who blended seamlessly into the background of any town he passed through. He moved like a shadow across the map, drifting from Ontario to Ohio, and finally down to the humid heat of Florida, leaving a silence in the places where children used to laugh. He was a photographer of sorts, though his subjects were never willing, and his portfolio was hidden away in the dark corners of a barn near his childhood home. In that barn, police would later find a diary. It was a meticulous ledger of his travels and his transgressions, a written confession of the darkness he carried with him. He wrote of the boys he met at the fishing holes, the ones he tricked with his quiet demeanor and his stuttering voice. He wrote of the riverbanks in Kitchener and the woodpiles in Findlay, recording the dates and the details with a cold, detached precision. To the people who met him, he was just a man sleeping in a rusted ice cream truck, living on peanut butter and milk, harmless and invisible. But on Mother's Day, May 12, 1968, the invisibility faded. The setting was a pond near the Dania Cutoff Canal in Fort Lauderdale. The afternoon sun was high, casting long shadows over the water where 11-year-old Lowell Nelson Williams and 10-year-old Kevin Polite were fishing. They were enjoying the freedom of a Sunday afternoon, unaware that they were being watched from the tall grass. Rice approached them, his stutter more pronounced in the heat of the moment. The encounter did not end with the quiet drift of the current. It ended with the sudden, jarring report of a sawed-off shotgun that Rice had concealed in his rubber boot. The violence was brief, a tear in the fabric of the day that left one boy gone and the other wounded. But Kevin Polite survived. He survived to point a trembling finger at the man who had tried to erase him, identifying the stuttering drifter who had walked away from the scene as if nothing had happened. Rice was captured days later, betrayed by his own voice during a routine traffic stop. He confessed to his crimes, to the trail of silence he had left behind him. But for the families of the boys in Ohio and Ontario, the answers came too late. Stanley Everett Rice died in prison in 2007, an old man whose secrets were finally buried with him. The threat is gone now. The rivers he haunted continue to flow, indifferent to the history they witnessed, washing over the stones and the secrets alike, cleansing the banks with the passage of time. From the open air of the riverbanks, we travel west to the enclosed silence of a suburban home in California. It is 1962, and inside a quiet bedroom in San Jose, a doctor is nursing a secret that is about to change everything.